brings us to informational items and reports. We will begin with a report on the fiscal impacts of proposed legislative bills 1316 and 1241. Mrs. Danik.
Thank you, President Boswell. I feel like I'm talking way too much at this meeting, so I'm going to just turn this over to Dr. Standish, who knows all about trying to tell us the impact of what's being discussed down at the legislature. And just so people know, we had a major change a year ago. Generally, before we feel all the effects of all those major changes, it takes a couple of years to get them all implemented. So these are changes on top of the changes that were already implemented a year in the last budget cycle, correct? Or at the end of the last budget cycle.
Thank you, Mrs. Danik. We are bringing this information to the full board. The Finance Committee typically does great work updating what we use a 3-year forecast to forecast and project out what budget implications might be ahead. So as we were having conversation about pending legislation and how that could impact the budget picture for the school district as we go into this next budget cycle, we felt it was important to bring this information to the full board. So tonight I'm going to give you a snapshot of what could be impacted in our budget picture under the proposed legislative bills 1316 and 1241. So as Mrs. Danik referenced, Governor Pillen, shortly after taking office, convened a workforce group, School Finance Reform Working Committee. On that committee represented varying school district sizes across the state, different groups, Rural School Association, the School Board Association, state senators, the governor's team, and so there was a group of people that came together in December of 2022 to craft concepts, ideas, and have discussion around school finance reform. That school finance reform led to the governor's education finance package, which was a series of 3 bills that were presented in 2023. Those 3 bills included LB 583, that was referred to the Education Committee, LB 818, and that was related to appropriations and the state budget process, and LB 243, which was referred to the Revenue Committee. So I think it's really important to start with the base concepts of the comprehensive package. So LB 583 in front of the Education Committee included a new element of school finance that's been talked about for a long time, which is foundation aid. That was important to certain groups that were represented in that committee. So there was an implementation of new foundation aid for the 23-24 school year. There was also an increase in special education reimbursement from 40% to 80%, along with an appropriation. The Education Future Fund was established. That fund was established with $1 billion plus intent language to add another $250 million annually. Work revolved around the Education Future Fund, which has a long list of things the Education Future Fund can fund, but the prioritization fell to equalization, special education, foundation aid, and then the list continues. And LB 243 with the Revenue Committee had a new soft property tax cap that was preserving local control. Keeping in mind, school districts are already governed by a spending cap. We're already governed by a levy lid. This was a new soft cap preserving local control. And that calculation was 3% plus factors for student growth, increasing students in poverty and increasing English language learners. For example, in Lincoln Public Schools, our base growth in 2023 was 3.61, and our base growth that is projected under new state models that have just come out recently within the last couple weeks is 3.55 for 2024. In addition to the base growth, the local Board of Education has the authority to exceed that base growth for Lincoln Public Schools by 4% with a 70% affirmative vote of the board. So that would be above the base, the local school board being able to make the decision based on the needs of that community. So if we fast forward 9 months, to where we are today, or 8 months to the beginning of the 2024 session, we have the introduction of LB 316. So LB 316 reaches into the comprehensive package and it looks at just one element. And the one element that it eliminates and strikes is the local control and soft cap. And it moves it all to the 3% hard cap. So it completely eliminates the Board of Education's local authority to make decisions by adding the additional 4%. There are short-term impacts and long-term impacts to LB 1316 that are really important to cover. And the first is the comprehensive education finance package has not been fully implemented yet. So the caps that were calculated last fall did not include the additional special education reimbursement because that additional special education reimbursement hadn't happened yet. That was planned for the 23-24 school year. So the cap calculation last fall did not include the additional special education reimbursement in the base number. You'll recall last summer, our community, and we talked about the additional revenue, and that factored into our budget decision-making process and the opportunity to access that additional revenue to lower the levy. So it was part of our local conversation, but it was not part of the cap and is not in the base for last year. So with that hard cap coming in, what would in effect happen for Lincoln Public Schools, based on the modeling from the Nebraska Department of Education and the revenue numbers that the governor's office prepared to reflect on the implementation of the package, our revenue with the additional special education reimbursement is detailed at $541 million. With the hard cap going to 2024, we would actually lose $14 million in revenue going into next year. So we would not have 3% growth, we would experience a 3% loss. And if you were to just put this in a math formula, the cap would be base growth plus 3% minus the special education increase in revenue for this year only. So that is the short-term challenge with this bill this year, is that it's mid-implementation and it will have consequences for school districts based on bringing in the new special education revenue. I want to spend a few minutes on LB 1316 and what will be the long-term impacts for schools. Schools are facing a labor shortage. I don't believe that's new news. I think we all know that we have a labor shortage. We are working hard to fill vacancies and to address the labor shortage. If we have a cap on salary and benefit growth, because that is the predominant stream in our budget that we'll cover, we would have an inability to recruit and retain quality workforce. This can result in unfilled teaching positions, larger class sizes, classes taught by staff maybe that is outside of their credential area or expertise. It would impact our ability to recruit and retain our workforce, such as paraeducators, bus drivers, custodial positions, all places where we are experiencing a labor shortage, and would impact our ability to serve students. And then we would also have to reflect on our current programming and services and have cuts there as we face growth and have a diminishing ability to address student needs. So just to put this in perspective, our budget is almost 90% salary and benefits. In Lincoln Public Schools, really the only contractor we use is a little bit of contracting for student transportation. And that's because of our shortage of bus drivers. So we do have in-house our own custodial, we have our own nutrition services. We actually run a monthly gross payroll of $30 million a month in this school district. So when you think about it, when dollars come into the school district, it is very much a part of the Lincoln economy with the payroll that we pay to employees across the city each month. A lot of people have maybe opinions or ideas about where school districts can make cuts. Often they look to administrators. So I think it's really important to say of that 90% of what the school district has in their general fund budget, how is the FTE distributed? And so 74% of our staff are teachers and school staff. So this is teachers, audiologists, speech pathologists, nurses, people that are directly serving students. We have about 12% that would be our operations team and our transportation team. That's predominantly custodians and bus drivers. We do maintain 8 million square feet of facilities. So we do have plumbers and electricians and painters and a staff that helps maintain our buildings and take care of our taxpayers' investment. We have school staff, we have office staff, and we have technical staff. We run a lot of computer systems, so that's about 9%. We have specifically security staff at about 2% and administrators at about 3%. So the vast majority of our staffing is in schools working and supporting students. When we think about a change in policy, so adding a hard cap for local school boards to work within as they develop their budget would be a dramatic change in policy for the state of Nebraska. And whenever we think about a major change in policy, I think it's really important to say, ask yourself the question, what would happen if this was in place 10 years ago? What would the long-term implications be? What would our situation look like today if this was in place? So if we reflect back 10 years, we can reflect on several points of decision making that this local community made related to programs and services for students. So our enrollment grew almost 4,000 students. We opened 5 new schools. We had an increased need for school staffing. We opened a career academy. We implemented a technology one-to-one initiative. We expanded and are continuing to seek to expand early childhood. We have security investments that went in during that time. The board adopted an initiative to have counselors in every school. We still, to date, have a portion of those counselors that are grant funded, and we have a long-range plan to bring those counselors into the general fund each year, but that will cost growth in the school district budget. We've expanded focus programs, and we've been addressing expanding student needs in the special education, English learners, and health services. So to think about this from a math economics standpoint, as far as looking at that 10-year trend, some people might say, okay, well, what did inflation do? I don't believe inflation is the best cost indicator for schools because 90% of our budget is staff. So when you look at inflation, that's normally consumer goods heavily driven by the price of gasoline, but that is just a line to give you a frame of reference for what inflation has done. We have another Bureau of Labor Statistic data point, which is the employee cost index. So this would give you a better look at what happened with employee cost, probably a better indicator of what a school district budget that's so heavily reliant on staff might do. And then we have to take into account student enrollment growth and all of the things I just shared on the previous slide of the need to support 4,000 additional students, 5 new school buildings, additional programming. So in Lincoln, we have had conversations that talk about student enrollment growth plus the employment cost index or plus cost, and that would give you the student enrollment plus the employee cost district line. So when I lay in our 10-year expenditure trend, you can see there's some peaks and valleys, but it's kind of mirroring what that student enrollment growth plus employee cost line would be. I would tell you we passed a bond issue in 2014. So when you look 2 years later, it's very logical when we were opening new schools that would be a higher budget year, and then we would come back down and so on as you walk through. You can definitely see the pandemic in the picture of 2020 to 2022 as far as cost and expenditures for the school district. One thing that's extremely hard to explain, and we try to explain it all the time, is that our revenue does not grow in incremental year-over-year pace. It changes based on the state aid formula. So when I bring in our revenue graph, that is actually our line for revenue. And so we need to spend a few moments on how a 3% cap could match with how revenue in school districts really works. So how revenue in school districts really works is you have a year where your valuations go up. The next year, your valuation is taken into account in the state aid formula and your state aid goes down. So in Lincoln, we often have 2 years worth of growth in 1 year. So we may have 7% growth in 1 year and then drop back down closer to 0 growth in another year. And so that revenue change, those swings in revenue we always talk about when we talk about our 3-year forecast plan, and the reason for that is the reason it will be very challenging for school districts to operate year over year with a 3% cap. Because in the year you have higher valuation, if you're limited to 3%, then the next year you lose the state aid, you can't get to 3% revenue growth. And that is the true concern of looking at a 3% cap. As I talked about, our state aid policy looks at valuation as the primary funding source for schools. This is the state aid model, needs minus resources equals aid. And so the very first thing that would happen is resources would go up and aid would go down the following year. In Lincoln, we've experienced that as we've had different percentages of assessed valuation historically in our school district. We had 22.5% increase in valuation last year, and that definitely stands out. And we will experience a very significant drop in state aid next year as a result of that. So you can see we are at the point where we have received a Nebraska Department of Education model of both state aid and the property tax cap. Those numbers are what we're using to kind of create this scenario for you tonight, to create some information that we expect our state aid to drop over $30 million. And if you look back to 2018, 2019, it's about half of where it was. So that is why the revenue has been changing and swinging year over year, is as we've increased in valuations, our state aid has dropped. And we have to have a process where we can smooth over multiple years. That is why that additional board authority is so critically important, that we would have access to that authority in years that we need it to help smooth out those revenue streams. LB 1241 actually eliminates all property value growth or access to property value growth. The original bill as drafted would reach back and roll you back to the previous year's property tax request. So it doesn't actually account for the change in state aid because of valuation. I will share with you that Senator Von Gillerin did share in his opening testimony on the bill, when he was opening on the bill for the hearing, that he understood that there were some challenges with the bill and that there would need to be changes made to recognize the state aid formula. So I do want to make that acknowledgement. But this bill also looks at a hard cap that would be looking to 0 growth in property tax request. We would not be able to recoup the loss in state aid. And so under this scenario, with 0 growth and the fact that the state equalization formula assumes that we are taxing at $1 for the local effort rate, we would experience a drop of $28 million under this proposal. So both proposals could significantly impact the budget planning for Lincoln Public Schools. We do need to think about what that impact might be for our local community and our budget process, where we gather feedback, community visions, community conversations, feedback from families and staff. We just completed a strategic plan process that was adopted earlier this evening, and so those strategic priorities are then left with local board decision making. Under the caps that are proposed in LB 1316 and 1241, we would have lack of authority to implement those new programs. In order to implement a new program, we would have to find something to cut to make room for the new program. So you wouldn't ever have like a net add effect in the school district, because you would have such limited growth that you would have access to. And in closing, just hitting some of the highlights, specifically looking at LB 1316, for Lincoln Public Schools for next year, it is not a 3% growth cap. That is how it could be described, but that is not how it'll play out for Lincoln Public Schools for 24-25. It will actually be a 3% reduction in revenue. We talked about the key things of the ability to attract and retain qualified staff, the ability to implement new programs and to support student needs, and the potential for reductions to current programs. I would also add, special education is under this cap long-term, and that's new for Nebraska. Normally, increases in expenditures for serving special education students has been outside of the spending lid. It has been under the levy lid, so it has been under that cap. But this cap, any increases in special education costs that you get reimbursed with revenue for, would then, under a hard cap, result in a reduction of your property tax request authority. So there are lots of pieces and parts that come together to build school finance in our state, and we wanted to share with you information about the implications of LB 1316 and 1241 if either passed in the form they are currently drafted in today, as we start to think about building our budget for the 24-25 school year. And with that, Mr. Boswell and Mrs. Danik, I will be happy to take any questions board members have.
Thank you, Dr. Standish. Any questions or discussion? Ms. Byer.
This is a lot to digest and will take a lot of thought. If we did a very gross calculation, this would mean that we probably would be reducing by 175 teachers. Obviously, that isn't how we go about doing things, so I don't want people running around thinking that's what we're going to do. But that's a lot of teachers, that's a lot of classrooms. This is hitting children, this is hitting students. Another thing that pops out that some people have often criticized us for is administrators. Well, there's your 3%, but we're running a big organization here, bigger than many corporations, and we need to have leadership. And leadership is the reason why a lot of our teachers, all of our teachers in fact, can go and deliver a quality education in our classrooms. We vet our curriculum. We go and we train our teachers. We support our teachers. Without administrators, we can't do that. We can't run an organization that impacts 43,000 students, children in our community without leadership. We can't go and supervise all those teachers, all those custodians, all those technicians, and so many more without administrators. In this day and age, the 2% for security, I think that Joe Wright and his team do an excellent job in making sure that our schools are secure. But we can't cut that. That isn't possible to cut. That's the safety, the health and safety of our children. Focus programs, that's where we bring in school choice. Our students deeply appreciate, and their families, the many choices that they have for career options that they can find in our schools. Early childhood education is critical to going and addressing Nebraska and Lincoln's shortage of workers. I know many young women that have told me they have to limit the hours they work or not work at all because it's too costly to pay for adequate, safe childcare. We provide early childhood education. We're not babysitters. We actually educate. We actually prepare young children in a safe environment to be prepared for school. We need to expand early childhood education. With these kinds of proposals in our legislature, we will not be able to do that. And to go and say that we can limit special education, that special education will be limited under these caps, is a disservice to our neediest students. I could go on, but this is very, very disturbing. We'll continue to have many discussions, but I hope that the legislature and the governor can hear this. This is not good for students. This is not good for families. This is not good for communities, and it's certainly not good for our economy. Thank you for the report.
Ms. Mumgard.
As usual, Dr. Standish, you brought a lot of clarity to a very large idea and concept. I think what I am hearing most from this is that if these bills go through, what we will have to think about is what we can still do that the community has asked us to do, is basically what it comes down to. And our ability to actually carry through community desires, as in, which is how we have our career academy, our focus programs, our child care, our early childhood, all of those things are going to be, those are the hard things we're going to have to consider in a couple of months. This is the facts, this is something we need to consider and what will happen.
There's two phases. There's the short-term shortfall, so that's going into next year. So as we start to build the budget model, we believe it's prudent right now to be looking at a forecast if these bills are adopted, and then we would continue our forecast under current law, because we always want to make sure we're bringing thoughtful information to the board to consider. As we look at the forecast, we will have a shortfall going into next year under LB 1316 or 1241 as currently written. I want to be clear about that. As the bills are currently written, we would have a budget shortfall for next year. So with the time we would have, I think we would look at what are some of those short-term intermediary things that we can do with that short runway to bring that budget to where we feel comfortable, where we think we can move on into the future. We would have to initiate a longer-term conversation with community stakeholders and talk about, as we look at reductions, where should we be looking for those reductions as a school district, as a board, because long-term, the year-over-year 3% and not being able to navigate swings in revenue will create that challenge where we could have a year where we're less than 3% because we don't have the revenue to access. So part of the way property works in the state aid formula, as you know, as you've been on the board, we may have a year where we would be higher than that 3.55 or that 3.61, could be even at a 7% because we're coming back down to a 1% to 2% the following year because of a loss in state aid. So looking back over the 10 years, if you apply these bills, that change in equalization aid is what we'd be navigating. We would also be navigating the pressure of employment and competing in the labor market. So additional challenge of such a restrictive cap right now is we just approved a teacher package at 4.55. So if a vast majority of our budget goes up by 4.55%, that means we have to come in and find a companion place to make up that difference. So I think the labor market currently makes it especially problematic to get our arms around and embrace the idea of a 3 to 4% cap based on the factors, considering what we know we're facing in the labor market. So I think the here and now, we would come up with a plan for next year to address the shortfall, but I think part of the conversation is also that long-range look at if we really are restricting schools to 3% total revenue growth, what does that mean? What does that mean for potential for salary and benefit increases to attract and recruit talented staff? What does that mean for a school district or community like in Lincoln, where there's a lot of conversation around early childhood? And there's a lot of different community collaborators who want to work together on that. But I know that we have had a process of expanding incrementally early childhood classrooms where we have space. That would then compete with, do we want to sustain programming in the school district as well, or do we want to make reductions from one hand in order to have an increase in the other? So the idea that the local board would have the authority to listen to their community and make decisions about revenue that would be available by taking away the board provision really changes the whole package.
And if these bills do not go through, we are still looking at some tight decisions we have to make in the next year, correct? Because of the bill that went through, because of the manner in which it's been created now with the 3% and the vote.
We would next year, so part of our plan as we developed last year's budget is we did know that when the additional special education revenue came in, the board would need to access the 7% growth, but that is to bring your revenue actually flat. So that doesn't mean your revenue is going to grow 7%. We have to then bring the revenue flat. And so we'd be in the situation where last year we had more revenue. This year going forward, we wouldn't have as much revenue, but we would balance between those 2 years. So I think it would mirror more our past model if current law stays in place.
Okay.
We are not going to ever be able to meet the needs. We are always going to have a list that is going to exceed the resources available. So we know that we're facing the ESSER funding cliff, the federal funding cliff this next year. So there will be reductions going into next year as well, which I think is what you're remembering. Mm-hmm. And so there will be unmet or unfunded needs as we go through the budget process, even under current law.
Thank you.
Mrs. Danik, then Dr. Rauner.
Thank you, President Boswell. Trying to do this without losing control. So I'm going to try and put this in the form of questions. In my 23 years on this board, I don't ever remember us operating without a levy cap, without a spending cap, and without swings based on the valuation. Am I correct?
Correct.
And when I first got on the board and everybody goes, nobody remembers that. And I said, well, no wonder you guys want term limits. You don't want anybody to remember things. We had a situation where they cut the levy, which is access to revenue, mm-hmm. to, I think it was 95 cents, and nobody could make it at 95 cents. So then they went up to $1, and lo and behold, we were back at $1.05. Mm-hmm. It took several years and a lot of pain of growing class sizes, of a lot of anxiety. I remember all of those issues. So now they're putting in a revenue cap to go with the levy cap and the spending cap, correct?
Correct.
Yet the state resources that they're supposed to, if I'm understanding it correctly, the state resources are based on our ability to access valuation as our revenue, a levy based on our valuation, correct?
Correct.
So that means here's all this money in this silo over here that we're going to decide how much you need, but you don't have the ability to access it because you can only go up 3%. So we're cutting our responsibility to make sure your children get a good education as the state because you don't get to access your local resources. Do I have this correctly?
You do. You do. So that is the pure challenge with the idea of the 3% is for equalized school districts. So I do think that's one thing we need to talk about is for an equalized school district who experiences that fluctuation based on the state aid formula. They are always working multiple years at one time. So you might have 2 years worth of revenue in 1 year, and you need to carry some forward to the second year. Now, I will say, just because I want to be very accurate and information-based, the implementation of foundation aid will mean more school districts will no longer be equalized. So more school districts will not experience that. under the NDE model for state aid that came out within the last month, we are still an equalized school district going into next year. So we are still experiencing that swing going into next year. It's hard to predict how many more years we will stay in equalization, but we will continue to be an equalized school district.
But we're losing $30 million.
In state
In
aid
state
because
resource.
of the rise in the valuation
That we can't access.
that we cannot recoup because of the 3% cap. Or partially that we can't recoup because of the 3% cap.
It's almost like a vicious cycle. So when my constituents call me and say, my valuation went up 30% on my house and my property taxes are X, Y, and Z, what do you mean you can't access this to fund my child's education? I'm trying to figure out the nicest way to say, here's your state senator's phone number, call him. But I can't do that here, so I won't do that here. The levy cap, we've operated under it. That's worked. The spending caps, we control our spending. This revenue cap seems like a cold smack in the face to people that work every day with everybody else's children. So I want our teachers, our school personnel, our community to know that we believe the education of our children is the most important responsibility in our community. So I'm just, the more things change, the more they stay the same, and I had hoped we would never be back at this place we were in 2001, 2, and 3, and it just seems a vicious cycle that goes back. So we have to stay on alert. And Dr. Standish gave a really good presentation here. She always does. I just like it better when you give me better news. Thank you, Dr. Standish. President Boswell.
Dr. Rauner, then Ms. Mumgard.
Yeah, I guess I'll try to be brief, but I think we negotiated in good faith last year with the governor and the legislature on trying to do the right thing. We did take the money that they increased our formula of special education, and we made one of the largest levy reductions I think we've ever made. We did our part, and it leads me to conclude either last year they were either A, negotiating in bad faith, or they don't even understand their own formula. But I think the general public does need to understand these cuts, we'll probably try to keep them as far away as from the classroom as we can, but that means things like cutting add-ons like the Career Academy or cutting athletic programs, and so the general public needs to know that's what's going to happen if either of these bills go through, and so I'd encourage them to contact and talk to their senators about it.
Ms. Mumgard.
So I just really want to thank you as a volunteer member of the community who has to sit here and try to figure out how to make decisions to make the institution that I think is one of the largest institutions in our city, that, we have 42, that we have more students than they do at the University of Nebraska. We have so many staff members who are depending on us to understand what is happening here. And I just really want to thank you, because it's like, if I am struggling and you have told me this 3 times, and it's still because my brain kind of goes, this doesn't make sense to me, because what I chose to do on being on the board was to be a voice of the community towards how can we have the best education for our students possible. To be told in one level is to be told that no, that's not exactly what you can do because you have all these lids. We can live with lids, we can figure that out, but that's part of what we do together. So I really appreciate you telling me one more time how this works, because for anybody else out there going, do they understand this? My answer is just barely. And thank heavens Dr. Standish and Dr. Neal, everyone can keep explaining to us what is going on. And working with the state school board, I mean, this is happening to school board members across the state who, we are just as volunteers trying to do our darndest to figure out how to do the best by not only our students, but all of the community members who depend on us knowing how to do this. And again, it's like, thank you for telling us what a tight situation we are in and may possibly be put into more. And so we can have, I don't know, we'll be ready, but at least it helps us to understand the implications. And those implications are not positive for what we are here to do. Thank you for helping us to understand that.
Any further discussion? Thank you, Dr. Standish. Are there any further reports from board committees? Are there any reports from special appointments?